Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today on this incredibly warm, unseasonably warm British weather. It's as hot today here in Cheshire as it was in September in Malta in 2023 when I was last there. So that's the idea of the heat. But I have literally just done a session with someone in Malta today, and she was saying it's 42. And that was at 9 a.m. So, yeah. I hope that you all have fans and lots of cooled drinks, and you're not suffering too much. So I am going to make a start. If someone can give me a thumbs up to say they can see the screen, please, that I'm sharing. Alex, can you see that? Fantastic. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Debbie Cannon, and I'm the lead for Trans Without Abuse. Thank you for joining this session. I know conferences can be full on, and online sessions especially can feel quite intense. So I'm going to do my best to keep this grounded in the reality of the frontline work. I transitioned myself 14 years ago, and in that time, I've seen a really significant shift in societal attitudes towards trans folks. Many people who were once ambivalent no longer are. The anti-trans rhetoric is now much more visible and much more harmful than it was, certainly when I started transitioning. I start there because those wider attitudes don't just exist in the media or in politics. They shape what happens when trans and non-binary people need housing, support, safety, and looking for somewhere to turn. That matters to me today because everyone, in my view, deserves a chance to exist as themselves without discrimination. And everyone deserves to be safe when they ask for help. Health and help. You may not work in trans services. I appreciate not everyone will, but you will be working in services that trans folks will need for support at some point. So although this session is about trans non-binary people, it's also about the kind of housing system that we want our systems to be. Okay, so I just want to touch upon the reality of housing right now. I want to start by acknowledging something that probably doesn't get said enough at conferences. Most of you are working in a system that's under huge pressure. You're stretched for options, you're making difficult decisions, and you're doing that all while balancing risk, availability, and safety with incredibly limited resources. So I recognize that I'm not speaking into an ideal world today. I'm speaking into a world that many of you are actually working in. So whether you're working in temporary accommodation, supported housing, first contact, assessments, crisis presentations, safeguarding concerns, all of it, I recognize that you're all working in a system that isn't perfect. I think it matters to acknowledge that because a lot of the challenges I'm talking about today don't just happen in theory. They're happening in a system that's already pressurized, where there often isn't a perfect option available. Oops, gone backwards. It had to happen. So why this session matters. So this session isn't about giving you something completely new to deal with. This is not an extra issue. It's an issue you're already facing as part of a frontline housing practice. The question isn't whether trans and non-binary people are already coming into contact with housing services, because we know that they are. The question is really whether services feel confident enough, safe enough, and informed enough to respond well in a way that doesn't further the trauma for the person who's engaging with your service. So what I'm really going to focus on today is how small shifts in practice can make a significant difference to safety, to trust, and engagement with those who are seeking housing support. I think that matters because if someone doesn't feel safe enough to be honest with you, then what you're assessing as their housing need might not actually be the full picture, and it could actually put them at further risk. So what looks like a housing issue sometimes is also a trust issue. What I'm trying to say is the quality of the interaction that the service user has with you matters just as much as the technical outcome. So language matters. I'm going to use a few terms today, so I just want to define them briefly. When I say trans, I mean someone whose gender identity doesn't align with the sex that they were assigned at birth. When I say non-binary, I mean someone whose gender identity is not exclusively male or female. Pronouns, I know it's a hot potato and some people really get passionate about this subject. It's just a word that refers to someone that's already been referred to. So when you use the right pronouns, it is one way of respecting and recognizing a person's identity. I haven't got this phrase in my presentation, but it's still important to highlight the cisgender is the opposite of trans, and it really means refers to someone whose gender identity does align with the sex that they were assigned at birth. I'm not going to stay here for ages, but I want to say this clearly. This isn't just about being polite. It's about trust. It's about ensuring all your systems have the right and accurate information on them. And it's about whether someone feels safe enough to tell you what is really happening when they're engaging with you as a housing professional. If someone feels dismissed, if they're misgendered in your service, or if they're uncertain about how they'll be treated, they may stop telling you what they actually need the most. So if that's the only thing that people take from this slide, I think it's enough. It's not just about being polite. It's about recognizing the person that's in front of you and ensuring that they engage with your service for the support that they actually need. Oops. Okay, right. Domestic abuse isn't always visible. So I want to start the core of this session with domestic abuse, because for many trans people, housing need doesn't come out of nowhere. It can be connected to family breakdown, controlling relationships, abuse linked to identity, coercion, rejection, and violence in the home themselves. One of the challenges for you in housing is that these experiences aren't always recognized as domestic abuse. Sometimes the person on the receiving end of the abuse will minimize their experience. Sometimes people just see it and misunderstand it as a relationship issue. And sometimes they're hidden entirely. If someone doesn't recognize that what they're experiencing is abuse, or doesn't feel safe enough to disclose it, then it doesn't enter the assessment for housing in the first place. So we can end up assessing homelessness, but not always the pathway into it. In homelessness work, what we often see is the end point. We see the presentation of the actual homelessness, we see the crisis and the housing problem, but for many trans folks, the story starts much earlier. I just think it's important to have that in mind as we go through today's session. So domestic abuse in housing. In housing settings, we often see the outcome. So we see homelessness, housing insecurity, unsafe housing, risk of eviction, but not always the cause of those outcomes. I think it matters because if we don't understand what someone is leaving, we can't properly assess what will actually be safe for them in the next option, the next phase of their journey in housing. Experiences of abuse can affect trust in professionals, willingness to disclose their experiences, and even how someone communicates. So just recognize if someone seems guarded, if they're not consistent, if they're withdrawn, if they're difficult to engage with, or if they're reluctant to answer direct questions, it might not actually be disengagement with you as a service. It might be for self-preservation or self-protection. If we interpret self-protection as evasiveness or non-cooperation, we cannot make the wrong judgment about the risk to the person who's presenting. I think it's really important in frontline housing because some of the behaviours we can read as being difficult are actually survival responses. So domestic abuse, it's more than physical violence. A lot of domestic abuse is subtle, cumulative, and it's not immediately visible, especially coercive control. When people think about abuse, they often picture physical assault, but abuse also includes psychological and emotional abuse, economic abuse, coercive and controlling behavior, threats, and sexual violence. That matters here because what isn't recognized as abuse won't shape the housing response. Somebody may still technically be housed, but be living in an environment of fear, control, or dependency. So if a person doesn't name that as abuse or doesn't feel safe in doing so, services can miss the real cause of homelessness risk altogether. Sometimes the danger isn't whether someone has a roof, but whether it's safe to remain under it. And I think that's a really important point to emphasize, especially with young people presenting. as an experience of familial abuse. Quite often, service providers will encourage a young person to go home when actually they're just going back to the place where they are being abused. So it's about asking questions to understand the cause of the reason why the person's there in front of you, and to take your time and create a safe space so they feel like they're able to disclose that to you. So why domestic abuse matters in the scale of the actual problem on a societal level. I just want to anchor this in the scale for a moment. It's not a niche issue. The social and economic cost is actually enormous. The number of people affected each year is staggering. So the estimated annual social cost of abuse to the economy, it's an average of £78 billion over a 3-year period of abuse. So for those of you who are mathematicians and have already done the sum, well done. But that's £26 billion per day, or £213.7 million. Sorry, £26 billion a year, or £213.7 million a day. I can't believe it actually costs the UK economy to £213 million a day to deal with the outcome of domestic abuse. We know from research that 1 in 4 women and 1 in 6 men will be a victim of domestic abuse in their lifetime. This figure jumps to 1 in 2 people in the trans and non-binary community. So 2.3 million people are victims of domestic abuse per year in the UK. So that's an estimated 4.8% of people aged 16 years and over. So nearly 5% of the population are impacted by abuse every single year. Right, I'm not trying to depress everyone. The reason I've included this here is because it helps us resist the idea that abuse is somehow separate from housing practice. I don't think it is. It's deeply tied to it. And for trans and non-binary people, the rates are even more stark. So when we talk about housing risk, homelessness, and engagement with services, domestic abuse has to be part of that conversation, especially when you consider 1 in 2 trans people will experience abuse at some point in their lives. If the pathway into housing need is abuse and the service only sees housing need, then part of the story is still missing. I'm not trying to shock you for the sake of it. This is all here to remind us that abuse is one of the routes into the housing need. Okay, I'll talk to you now about a topic that will underpin everything that we're going to be talking about here today. People don't experience housing abuse or exclusion through one identity alone. So gender identity doesn't sit separately from race, from disability, from class, from sexuality, from immigration status, from age, from poverty or care experience. These things all intersect. And that matters because there's no single trans experience. There is no one-size-fits-all response that will feel safe to everyone who engages with you as a frontline professional in housing. So intersectionality was a concept that was first... So Kimberly Crenshaw described intersectionality as a lens through which you can see where power comes and collides and where it locks and intersects. So in other words, what she's saying is that there's not just one element of a person that affects how they can engage with society and use services. I find this really useful in housing because so much of what we are talking about isn't just about one piece of a person's identity. It's about what happens when multiple kinds of disadvantage or exclusion meet systems that aren't always designed for complexity. And when that happens, people can fall through the gaps very quickly. So what intersectionality means in housing, it means that some people face multiple barriers at once. It means a housing option that looks reasonable on paper may not feel safe in practice. It means risk increases when services aren't designed to respond to complexity. So for example, a trans person who's disabled, who's racialized, who's young, and they're leaving abuse, or has an insecure immigration status, may encounter overlapping risks that shape what is actually safe and what is actually accessible. So when we talk about inclusion in housing, we're not really talking about one category. We're talking about whether the system can cope with real people's lives. Complexity does not sit in the person. Often it sits in how the system responds to the person who's engaging with the service. So a placement that looks reasonable for one person may be completely unsafe for someone whose life is shaped by multiple forms of disadvantage. And I'll give you a real life example here. So I've been supporting a victim of domestic abuse who's a non-binary person. She was in the UK, they were in the UK on an immigration visa. The perpetrator was using their immigration status as a way of coercively controlling them. They had issues with disabilities that got worse as they were going through cancer treatment, and he was using this as a way of abusing her because he was their only carer. She uses they, her pronouns. That's why I keep changing between the pronouns when I'm describing their experience. So not only was their abuse and coercive control gone on the relationship, she relied on this person for care, and they were disabled, so their options were limited in terms of housing. They are now safely living in another part of the UK and in housing, but there's still issues going on for that person at the moment. They've gone from one geographical area to another, so there's issues with getting care in. At the moment, the house is chaos, and they've moved in, but things still aren't settled. They've now registered with a GP, which is one of the main things because of their medication needs. But there are so many issues to think about when someone presents at a housing. It's not just, is this house, can I get a house for them? And then that's it. You have to think about all the intersectional needs this person has. And actually, one of the things that we did when they were still in their old property was get them collapsible ramps so they could get out of the property without having to rely on their ex and phoning him to get them out of the home. Their new home isn't adapted. So whilst it's a great choice because it's in a new area and everything else, they're still having to make do and make best. I have a disabled friend who's from the trans community who's a CEO of a charity, and he's told me that most homes in the UK actually have to be adapted by the person in them. They're not like adapted for them before they actually enter the property, which I didn't actually know either. So it's about thinking about all of these things that intersect when you're offering housing. What we know from trans non-binary perspectives of housing, we know that many have experienced housing insecurity, including rough sleeping or sofa surfing. We know around 1 in 4 have been homeless at some point. We know the family rejection and unsafe home environments are key drivers for homelessness in young trans and non-binary people. And when you put that together with the wider hostility, including the anti-trans rhetoric and what's going on currently in legislation, Alex will talk about that in a little bit, this all shapes how people are treated by family, by friends, by colleagues, and by strangers. It's important to highlight this for housing because these things don't stay in the background. They affect whether a home is safe, whether the family is protective to the individual, or whether someone is forced to leave their home, and whether people feel able to seek help. Importantly, multiple marginalized groups within trans communities, so disabled trans people of color, or intersex trans people, report even higher levels of discrimination, which means housing vulnerability is increased and it makes services harder for them to access. So the issue isn't whether this affects housing, it clearly does. The issue is whether services recognize it early enough. All this data as well was taken from Transactual's Trans Lives report. It's the largest ever UK service to trans people with over 3,000 respondents. It is available on Transactual's website as well. If you ever want some information around trans identities, it is a fantastic place to start. I use it with my own work. So what we know and what providers should do anyway. I want to be transparent about the limits of the evidence. We know that nationally, trans people are at a higher risk of housing insecurity and that UK-wide evidence exists. What we don't know locally is much more frustrating. We don't have a good local or regional trans-specific homelessness data. It just doesn't exist. Official data sets generally do not identify trans status. So if you're looking for a neat local number, very often the data simply isn't there. What I would say to you, that absence of data shouldn't become a reason for inaction. What providers should do anyway is use the national evidence alongside local pressures. So what you know about temporary accommodation demand, hidden homelessness, domestic abuse related presentations, unsafe placements and barriers to engagement. This isn't about waiting for the perfect evidence because you're not going to get it. It's about acting responsibly on the evidence that we do have. If a group is at known national risk and your local service has no specialist pathway, that's already a question that's worth asking. I know I don't want to hammer the point too much, but absence of data doesn't equate to absence of need. I think it's important to highlight that. So, statutory test for homelessness. Do we think it's inclusive? I'm sure this 5 tests will be familiar to many of you, so I'm not going to go through them all. Homelessness or threatened with homelessness, eligibility, etc. I want us to think about this. These tests appear neutral on paper, but how they are interpreted and applied can affect who actually gets through the door. So the question I'm asking here is not whether the framework exists. The question is whether the experience of moving through that framework for a trans or non-binary person feels inclusive, is it safe, and is it responsive in practice? I'll give you that example earlier about the homeless or threatened with homeless. If a family is saying to services that they are supportive of a young trans person, but that person is having to leave due to identity-based abuse, they're already going to fail at the fall at the first hurdle. So I think it's important to think about this and not just assume if a young person has the offer of a bed at home, but they're telling you it's not safe. I think we need to believe the person who's presenting. So where these tests can become a barriers, this is where things become very real. ID mismatch or family non-acceptance may not be recognized as homelessness. Domestic abuse may be minimized by the person or misunderstood by the person who's doing the assessment. Priority need can be inconsistently applied, especially where mental health, trauma, or vulnerability are involved. Lack of a local connection can push people back towards unsafe places. So the issue is not just the existence of the test, it's how these are interpreted and how we apply them. Trans people can end up being filtered out before support really starts. And once someone feels filtered out, their trust in services can drop extremely quickly. Sometimes gatekeeping doesn't feel like one big exclusion. It's a series of smaller moments that add up to the trans person thinking the service isn't really for them. So a good example of this is a young trans man called Jay, whose story was shared by Stonewall Housing. After coming out, he was forced to leave home and spent weeks sofa surfing. On paper, someone like that might not always look like a straightforward homelessness case right away. But in reality, they're already in crisis because they're having to sleep on people's sofas rather than have their own safe space. Think about a young person who's been experiencing familial abuse. If they're having issues with healthcare, work, etc., it just adds to the picture of the trauma that this person is going. Another example is the Albert Kennedy Trust found 77% of young people, they support family rejection and abuse after coming out, or being outed was the main reason for their homelessness. And 22% were homeless because of the hostile living conditions or domestic abuse. That tells us what looks like a housing issue often starts as abuse, starts as coercive control or rejection from their family that hasn't been named properly. How ordinary housing processes can shut trans people out. It's a really important central question I want to sit with for a second. Are trans people being excluded only by explicit policy, or also by ordinary processes, by assumptions, and by decisions? Quite often, exclusion doesn't happen through one act. It happens through routine assessments, everyday paperwork, inconsistent decisions, poor signposting or just lack of signposting, assumptions about a person's safety, assumptions about their credibility, assumptions about where someone can and can't go. And this is why it matters to all housing services, not just specialist ones. I'm going to give you an example of something that we were made aware of. So I work in Cheshire, and we had a phone call from a trans woman who'd been refused by a women's domestic abuse service because she was a trans woman. So she then went to a male domestic abuse service and said, well, no, because you're a woman. So they didn't signpost this person and they left them in no person's land, like without even signposting them to organizations who could potentially help them. So, you know, I could understand why a person faced with those kind of problems and responses in the housing would just go back to the person who was abusing them in the first place, because what other choice do they have other than sleeping on the street? It's important to remember this when you're dealing with people. So what are the barriers to accessing housing? I've grouped the barriers here into 3 areas: systemic barriers, practice barriers, and trust barriers. So system barriers can be the statutory test itself, the way the guidance is applied, and the fact that protections against discrimination are not always enforced consistently, as the example I gave a few seconds ago actually proved. Practice barriers include unconscious bias, decisions about placements, private rented options that may overlook hostility or harassment, and binary systems that don't reflect trans and non-binary lives well. Then there's trust barriers. There's fear of being misgendered, disbelieved, or treated unsafely in services. Previous negative experiences that might not even be with your service, but if someone's gone to a statutory service and they've had a bad experience, there's going to be that trauma response potentially when they engage with you as a service provider. So it's all about making a safe space and having that in the back of your mind when you're dealing with these people. And they may also have a reduced confidence the service will actually be welcoming to them. What matters, I think it's important to emphasize, that these barriers interact with each other. A person may already be wondering whether support is really for them. If the process feels like it's being gate kept, if it's not safe or it's inconsistent, that doubt becomes confirmed. So I just want you to reflect for a moment, where in your own process might someone stop feeling safe enough to disclose that they're experiencing abuse? And I'm going to have a drink of water. If you want to think about it privately, it's absolutely fine, but this is often where the real work sits. UK housing researchers found that 2/3 of LGBTQ plus people said they would not ask help from their local authority if they became homeless. That's huge. It tells us that many people face barriers before the assessment even starts. If they don't believe the service will understand them or treat them fairly, then just not going to engage with them in the first place. So how do we reduce harm when options are limited, Debbie? That's a fantastic question. I'm going to do my best to answer that one now. In an ideal world, we'd always be able to offer the perfect housing option. This isn't Disney, and we don't live in an ideal world anyway, but it's not the reality that most of you are working in. I think it's important to say this out loud. Most of the challenges around trans inclusion don't come from people not caring. They come from making difficult decisions in imperfect situations. So the question becomes, how do we reduce harm when options are limited? If you're comfortable, can you just put a yes in the chat if you've ever had to make a housing decision where there was no ideal option? I'm going to give you a few seconds. Yeah, okay. Yeah, there's a few. Okay, so this is the reality I want to speak into. It's not about perfection, it's about harm reduction. So what does safer practice look like? I'm not going to cover the EHRC guidance in detail because Alex is going to be addressing that later in the session. What I do want to focus on is this: whatever the wider policy discussion, safe practice is still possible. Safer practice looks like using a person's lived names and pronouns. It looks like not outing them unnecessarily. It looks like keeping sensitive information on a need-to-know basis. It looks like making decisions based on safety and need rather than making assumptions about a person's experience. And it looks like avoiding blanket exclusion thinking. Remember that example I gave you a few moments ago about that trans woman going to a female domestic abuse service? Even if they're not going to support her, they should have signposted her. So even when services feel uncertain, there are still things that reduce harm and can increase trust for the service user. I know uncertainty can often make an organization more cautious, but caution doesn't always make people feel safer. Oops, wrong way. Where this matters most in housing. This is where trans inclusion becomes real. It's not abstract policy terms, but in everyday decisions. assessments and first contact, temporary accommodation placements, shared single-sex spaces, repairs, antisocial behaviour, tenancy sustainment, signposting, escalation routes. In all of these services, if a person's misgendered, outed, placed unsafely, not believed, or not signposted on, these aren't small administrative errors. They've got real life consequences, and they will make a person not trust or engage with services safely. So when I talk about inclusion, this is what I mean. The everyday points a person acts with your service and whether they feel safe or if it feels like the door's closing. Policy sits in documents, I understand that, but the support is experienced in the contact with the person. At first contact, understanding matters. Stonewall Housing, again I'm using them, said 97% of their service users say it matters that the caseworker understands what it's like to be LGBTQ+. I'm not saying you have to be from the community, but even if you've got points of contact that are visible in their support of those identities, it makes such a massive difference. Do you remember Jay I mentioned earlier who was sofa surfing? He said once he reached an affirming service, he was able to secure somewhere safe. He got mental health support and he started rebuilding his life. So the quality of first response really does shape what the outcome is and what comes next for the person. Okay, supported housing and tenancy sustainment, everyday practice. I wanted one slide here that focuses specifically on everyday practical settings where this often becomes really immediate. In supported housing, privacy can matter enormously. Sometimes safety is increased by small choices around space, visibility, and whether inclusion is actually made visible in the environment that the person's housed. In tenancy sustainment, there are lots of ordinary processes that can either support someone well or actually create more harm. So proactive check-ins, repair processes, ASB procedure, escalation routes, how information is recorded, and whether staff stop to ask, is what looks like neighbourhood issues or arrears or chaotic engagement linked to domestic abuse? Is it fear? Is it harassment? Or is there any identity-based harm going on? The amount of times that I've had a person who's been experiencing abuse and things are getting smashed in the house and people automatically assume it's the person who's presenting to the services asking for help when actually they're the victim of abuse, and things are, you know, the perpetrators using those coercive threats as a way of making them stay in those relationships. So just stop and have a think about this. Like, it's not always that obvious. I understand, but it's about making those safe spaces and having those conversations, not being afraid to have them. This is where co-production matters. If services want to improve, the people affected need to be part of shaping what safer practice actually looks like. So nothing about us without us is a phrase I use all the time. Very often the issue isn't one dramatic safeguarding failure. It's low-level friction repeated over and over again. Okay, so small changes that you folks can make that could actually make a massive difference to a person engaging with your service. I want to bring this back to something really practical. These aren't expensive changes, but they're huge structural changes. They're small, consistent signals that support is safe to engage with. Use affirming language, be trauma-informed, be person-centered, recognize exclusion isn't mandatory despite what you might read in the media, and let people shape what safety looks like for them. Remember, nothing about us without us. I know this all sounds simple, but in a pressurized system, they matter hugely, because often it's the small signals that tell someone whether they are welcome, whether they're believed, and whether they can just risk being honest with you. So when someone comes into your service at their most vulnerable, what helps them feel safe enough to tell you the truth? I think we've already covered it, haven't you? It's all of those small things. Trans people aren't asking services to solve everything. I wish you could. But what they are asking is, at the point when they need help the most, they'll be seen, they'll be believed, and they'll be kept safe. The answer to that question is that they just want to live their lives in peacefully and where their identity are respected. Okay, I just want to say thank you for your ears in that presentation. There's our website, transwithoutabuseorg.uk, our email and our phone number. You can find us on LinkedIn, either me personally, Debbie Cannon, or Trans Without Abuse. I am going to stop sharing, and hopefully you won't see how sweaty I am. But thank you all. I appreciate you. Oh, I'm now going to introduce the lovely, I forgot to introduce you there, Alex, sorry.
Okay.
Alex, she, her from Stonewall Housing, who's now going to go through the implications of the EHRC. Over to you, Alex.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for being here, but thank you, Debbie, for such a comprehensive and powerful presentation that really felt so rooted in the realities of the housing system and also what can be done, I think, in kind of day-to-day frontline practice. I'm Alex. I go by she and her pronouns, and I am a senior practitioner at Stonewall Housing. And my role kind of focuses on supporting housing and homelessness organisations around their LGBTQ plus inclusive practice. And I'm just going to share my screen. And let's just have a look. Open the chat box. Can you see that, Debbie, and anyone else?
Yep.
Okay, brilliant. Some thumbs up, which I really, really appreciate. I'm here to follow Debbie's presentation to talk a bit about a resource that's been developed in collaboration between 3 specialist organisations. And the resource is called Trans Inclusion Beyond the Supreme Court Ruling. And this is a resource that's been created by AKT, Gendered Intelligence and Stonewall Housing. So AKT is the leading LGBTQ plus youth homelessness organisation. Gendered Intelligence is a trans-led and trans-involving charity that works to increase understandings of gender diversity and improve the lives of trans people. And Stonewall Housing is the UK's leading LGBTQ plus homelessness organisation that works with LGBTQ plus people of all ages. And I'm mindful I'm following Debbie's talk, which had a lot of kind of useful aspects around that kind of both the system that we're operating in, but also frontline practice. Today, I'll just do a little bit to reiterate some of what Debbie said around the importance of trans inclusive housing and homelessness services. But I'm also here to give some context on some of the kind of legal landscape at the moment, and particularly around April 2025's UK Supreme Court ruling on the definition of sex for the purposes of the Equality Act, and also the Equalities and Human Rights Commission Code of Practice for Services, which came out in May in draft form. And I guess I'm really here to share some information about the resource we've created to support organisations in the kind of thinking process for embedding or maintaining trans inclusive practice whilst complying with the law. A bit of a caveat and a note, AKT, Gendered Intelligence and Stonewall Housing are not legal professionals. We're specialist organisations that have been doing the work that we've been doing for a long time. But what that means is this presentation or the resource we've created are not legal advice, they're not intended to be, and they're not substitutes for it. And we know that there is lots of kind of legal uncertainty at the moment, and organisations and services and workplaces have lots and lots of questions because the practical implications of the Supreme Court ruling, which I'll talk about later, haven't fully been ascertained yet. And in this context of uncertainty, one of the things we are suggesting is for organisations to seek legal advice where they need it from suitably qualified, but specifically trans knowledgeable lawyers. And our aim in the resource that I'll talk about is to support organisations to make the best use of any legal advice they receive, but ultimately our focus is on how can organisations make decisions about their policies, about their practice, about how they run, to support the people that are using their services day in and day out, and to also support the people that are working in those services. I think it's really worth noting, and Debbie's touched on this already in terms of the kind of social discourse, but conversations around trans and non-binary people's rights and lives is often framed in our media and our politics um, corrosively as a debate where the rights of different groups are pitted against one another. And of course, within our workplaces and services, people might have different opinions and beliefs, and people have different identities and experiences moving through the world. But it was really important to us when creating this resource that we were really, really specific about our starting point, which is that people's lives or rights should not be up for debate, that trans and non-binary people are the expert in who they are. They should be treated with dignity and respect, and trans people have the right to live safe, livable lives. Debbie used the word peaceful earlier, and also have the right to privacy and to be protected from discrimination and harassment. And that includes in this space too. So kind of the invitation here is to kind of engage with the questions and the discussions from a place of respect for the difference that might be in the room. I guess I really want to acknowledge different lived experiences that both might be here, but will be in your teams, will be in your kind of groups of service users. And when we're talking about a topic like the UK Supreme Court ruling or the EHRC code, the people of trans experience are most impacted by these charged conversations. And a bit of note on my positionality. So I am a white, cis, not trans, queer woman. So I'm not a person with trans experience myself. When we were creating this resource, something we really thought about was how do we thread through that principle of centering trans voices in the decisions that affect their lives and giving appropriate weight to people's lived experience, which the Supreme Court ruling did not do, and also to really emphasise the importance of allyship and solidarity. So services and organisations and workplaces thinking about how to actively work in an inclusive way and actively set inclusive policies. So Debbie already kind of covered some aspects around trans and non-binary people's pathways into homelessness and the importance of safe services. And she also touched on the limits of some of the data sets. And I loved what you said there about how the kind of absence of data doesn't necessarily mean the absence of need. I wanted to share a little bit about what we know from some of the specialist services. We know about the urgent need for inclusive and affirming housing and homelessness due to what we kind of call or understand as the disproportionality of trans and non-binary people's experiences of homelessness and housing insecurity, which affects trans and non-binary young people most of all. So we've put some kind of data on the screen. It's definitely not as visual as Debbie's slide was, but the England and Turnbull National Survey on LGBTQ+ homelessness found over a third of trans and non-binary and agender individuals reported at least one form of homelessness in the last year. And that was sofa surfing, living in temporary accommodation, rough sleeping, experiencing domestic abuse. And 43% of trans and non-binary people had experienced abuse from a family member or members, according to research from Gallup. And according to some research from Stonewall in 2018, the other Stonewall, not Stonewall Housing, 19% of trans people and 19% of non-binary people had experienced domestic abuse in a relationship in the last year. And I'm kind of adding that to Debbie's stat, around 1 in 2 trans people will be victimised by domestic abuse in their lifetime. What all this means is, and how it kind of shows up, is that in our service, Stonewall Housing, a specialist LGBTQ+ service, 27.8%, so over a quarter of the people that we support or supported last year, were trans and non-binary. Hidden homelessness is incredibly common, and we are really seeing some of the barriers to accessing services that Debbie spoke about in her presentation. And this is why trans inclusive services and protecting people from discrimination and harassment when working in our services is so important. So something I'm here to kind of talk about is the kind of some of the legal context around the UK Supreme Court ruling on the Equality Act and the EHRC Code of Practice. This is quite legal, it's quite technical. I'll be giving a really, really top line overview, but then sharing information about our workshop and consultancy resource if you think your organisation would like to have more space to think through the implications of some of what I'll talk about today. So just a bit of a background, you might have heard of the Equality Act. This is a piece of legislation that exists to grant protections from unlawful discrimination, harassment and victimisation. It does this on the basis of protected characteristics, which are on the right-hand side of my slide. The language that the law uses around trans and non-binary people's experiences is gender reassignment. And the Equality Act covers the provision of goods and facilities and services and membership of associations and employment and education. So it covers a huge amount of ground. A principle of the Equality Act is that services should be open to everybody unless there is a really good reason for them not to be. So inclusion is the default position. And then there are provisions in the Equality Act if we need to target facilities or services or want to target facilities or services to certain groups. We understand this as being permissive, not prescriptive. So it allows an organisation to justify targeting their services, but it doesn't say that they have to do that in every single circumstance. One of the provisions to target your services that you might have heard about is a kind of provision around single sex or separate sex services. So there are particular provisions around providing those in the Equality Act, and there's the Equality Act also touches on communal accommodation. Like single sex or separate sex communal accommodation, but there are other provisions and mechanisms in the Equality Act as well that allow an organisation to think through how they might want to target their services. Now, in April 2025, there was a UK Supreme Court ruling on the definition of sex for the purposes of the Equality Act. And when in the kind of writing of this ruling, it said that it clarified existing law. There's lots of history to this. Essentially, it began as a challenge to the Scottish minister's interpretation of the definition of women for the purposes of counting women and gender representation on public boards. Namely, it focused on the question whether Scottish ministers right to count trans women when counting the number of women on boards. And this went through lots of legal levels, judicial reviews, some appeals, and the 2025 Supreme Court ruling is on the screen, and it ruled and decided on a definition of sex that is based on the sex that someone was assigned at birth. It feels important to note that the ruling uses language of biological, which was not defined by the ruling. And in the resource we've created, we aim not to replicate it unnecessarily because it's really reductive and doesn't take into account people's lived experience of gender. And we prefer to use the language around the sex that someone was assigned at birth. Before the Supreme Court ruling, many services the previous services code generally allowed for trans people to use facilities and services in line with their lived gender, trans inclusively. There were some exceptions to this that organisations took up, but they had to kind of justify doing so. But many organisations operated or had policies around operating in a more could have those policies to operate on a more trans inclusive basis because it was largely more practical and workable as an approach. However, this ruling now has implications for the provision of facilities and services that call themselves single or separate sex services or facilities, and it has lots of other implications, but that is one of the most significant ones that we see facing different accommodation services and supported housing, refuges, etc. What I would say is that the there is much that we could say and that we do say in our resource about very, very real concerns about the process of the Supreme Court ruling and the very, very real implications on our social, political, and media discourse about trans rights and lives, and how harmful that has been, and how that has kind of fed, both reflected and fed into a broader kind of hostile discourse around trans rights and lives, which is having a very, very real impact on people's well-being and a very, very real impact on kind of barriers to accessing services as well. A bit of a reality check that trans and non-binary people do remain protected from unlawful discrimination, harassment and victimisation on the basis of gender reassignment under the Equality Act, and that absolutely has not changed. And this can include discrimination that is direct or indirect, on the basis of perception and on the basis of association. And there's also other laws that haven't changed. So the Human Rights Act, for example, and there's still kind of privacy protections that do exist and are in place that protect people's privacy around their trans status and gender history. And that includes things like GDPR and what the Information Commissioner's Office says and the Gender Recognition Act. So there's other kind of legal context here as well. In light of the ruling, the Equalities and Human Rights Commission has revised their code of practice for services, public functions and associations, which is currently in draft form. It was laid before Parliament, and whilst the community is trying to challenge it, this code is already shaping the ways that organisations are kind of thinking about services and facilities and kind of interpreting and complying with the Equality Act. The code provides guidance for services, but it is not legislation itself. It doesn't provide, or it doesn't cover employment. There will be a separate code around that in due course. And whilst it isn't legislation, it is statutory, and what that means is it should be considered carefully by organisations, and like it uses the language of either must or should, depending on what the kind of duties of services and public functions and associations are. It's really, really important to name that with all of this, the ruling, the code, etc., this is relevant to things like the provision of services, the duty of employers, etc. But it is about organisations. It isn't about the people that use your services. So it isn't kind of legislation that tells people what they can and can't do. So it's just something to hold in mind there, that this is about how organisations set policy and set practice. It isn't saying what a trans or non-binary person can and can't do as they themselves move through their lives. But what we do know is that the impact of the ruling and the code is having very, very real impacts around exclusion and self-exclusion from services that people deserve and need, and have the, should have the right to access. Just a bit of an example of the challenge around this code of practice. 148 MPs signed an early day motion for it to be disapproved in Parliament. That was the figure when I checked yesterday. And there are just very, very real concerns, both from the EHRC's Equality Impact Assessment themselves, but also another part of the government, the Office for Equality and Opportunity. Both of those bodies did equality impact assessments on the code, and both of them are really quite damning about the impacts on trans people. And we cover some of the implications in the resource that I'll talk about now, and I've mentioned some of this already, but these very real impacts include exclusion, providers not having the space or the funding to think about providing gender neutral alternatives to kind of gendered spaces, impacts around involuntary disclosure or forced outing of trans people, risk to trans people's safety if accessing inappropriate services. I'm thinking of the story, the kind of case story that Debbie shared earlier, And it also has very real implications for around the policing of gender, which is really, really harmful to so many people. Trans and non-binary people, but also anyone who is deemed not to meet the kind of cultural and social expectations of kind of femininity or masculinity. And we know that this ruling and the way this kind of social discourse that we're seeing in our media and in our politics is going to have a really real impact on so many people. And because of kind of racialized and heteronormative stereotypes about, for example, femininity, we know that this will particularly impact queer people, people who are racialized from the global majority, and other groups as well. So the policing of gender harms everybody, and in our organisations, we really believe it should be challenged. I'm going back to that slide later that I just skipped through. But I guess I wanted to kind of pause and say this is a lot of different, quite technical legal context around, the Equality Act, the clarification in the law, the code for services. And what we know is that there are services up and down the country who want to embed or maintain trans inclusive practices and policies and a stance, and maybe asking, how do we do that? What do we need to think about? How do we make those decisions? How do we justify those decisions? How do we draw on the evidence base that exists? How do we feel responsible for providing safe, inclusive services, and we want to do that, but we have questions about how. We at Stonewall Housing, AKT and Gendered Intelligence believe that trans inclusive policies and practices remain the most practical and workable options for many of our services, and indeed that the code in some cases puts organisations in really unworkable positions. And so we hope that organisations will take opportunities for organisations to actively, explicitly and clearly embed trans inclusion. Our position is that organisations should say, okay, how do we do this? Not should we do this? And then proceed from there. And this is about making an active decision around policies and practices that are trans inclusive. We, I guess, both know that many of the kind of aspects of trans inclusive practice, including the ones that Debbie spoke about earlier, are absolutely not impacted by the Supreme Court ruling around providing trauma-informed care that is person-centred, referring and addressing someone with their lived name and pronouns, signposting appropriately, thinking about harm reduction, so many other things, those interpersonal interactions that can really build safety. Those are not impacted by the UK Supreme Court ruling, but then there might be some things about how is your service set up or targeted that might need some consideration. And we have created a resource to support organisations to think through the provisions and mechanisms that might be available to them. And the way that we have done that is by creating a bit of a kind of a toolkit of guide questions to support organisations through their thinking. So the kind of resource we've created is in the following format. We send out some pre-session questionnaires. We ask people about the setup of their organisation, who they are, what they do they run any gendered services, what's their setup at the moment, then staff knowledge levels, things like that. And then we either provide a workshop for a group of staff or a consultancy conversation with a couple of kind of key figures in the organisation. We're hoping to run some open sessions, which will be advertised in due course. And then we send out a kind of post-session toolkit resource with the kind of toolkit and kind of workbook of questions, I suppose, and all of our references, all of that evidence that might help people kind of back up and justify their stance around inclusivity. And this is a toolkit of guide questions, essentially to support organisational decision making. And this decision making will depend completely on the context of your specific organisation, and will kind of cover a lot of the things on the screen. So it will be about who you are, how you're set up, what are your aims, what are you good at, what's your expertise, what are the needs of the people that you serve, what other services do and don't exist in your area, obviously the law, any legal advice you've received, and also your threshold for risk as well. And that feels important to mention because, as I said earlier, the practical implications of the UK Supreme Court ruling haven't been fully ascertained. They are likely to be the subject of further court litigation, and this means that there isn't obvious kind of risk-free routes for organisations at the moment. Organisations that are both exclusionary towards, like that set policies that are exclusionary towards trans people, and organisations that set trans inclusive policies in different contexts may be open to kind of complaint or legal challenge. And we do expect to see some of those kind of complaints and legal challenges kind of go through the court. And that is why our emphasis is on making thoughtful decisions, recording and documenting that decision-making process, and then kind of rooting that in the specific context of your organisations, because each case will hinge on its own specific facts. Part of this will be around seeking legal advice if you need to, again, legal advice that is trans knowledgeable, and also things around like your policies and processes, including how you respond to any complaints should they arise. So I guess I've kind of given an overview of the resource, and I've talked a little bit about kind of the types of things it might include. I haven't given loads and loads of substance about the kind of the guide questions that we go through, and that's partly because of time, and it's also partly because of how specific these questions will be to each different organisations. What I have put on the screen is a QR code to the Stonewall Housing website where you can find out more about the resource, and I'll be sharing that flyer out by way of follow-up. And I've also put the Stonewall Housing email address, and we're kind of divvying up kind of delivery and working with different providers between us at Gendered Intelligence, Stonewall Housing and AKT. And I just want to reiterate, the trans and non-binary people are absolutely the experts in who they are. The law can't tell someone who they are, and have the right to privacy, to be protected from discrimination and harassment, and should be treated with dignity and respect. If you think this resource might be able to help you, please be in touch. We're making some kind of updates based on the code of practice, but we are kind of in conversation with interested organisations at the moment. Oh, and I've seen a very useful message from someone in the chat, Emily Fairweather, about the Frontline Network's training fund can award grants for kind of supporting skills development and accessing training opportunities. Okay. Sorry, I went slightly over there. I'm going to stop sharing and then go back to yourself, Debbie, and the chat box.
Thanks, Alex. Love that.
I can't see any questions at the moment in the Q&A.
Me neither. We must have blown everyone away so much with our like breadth of knowledge that we just stunned them into silence.
I like that interpretation, Debbie.
I'll say it all the time when I'm present. Alex, what do you see the biggest challenge with the housing providers going forward and trying to interpret this guidance? I'll ask you.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think there's a couple of things, and actually I was speaking to kind of one of our colleagues in one of the other partner organisations about this recently. I think that the law is really, really complicated. It's gotten really complicated. And what this means is that it's expecting people who work in services often want to do the right thing by the people that they're managing or working alongside or working with. It demands quite a lot of kind of complex technical knowledge. Organisations might need to seek legal advice, might not be able to afford it. They might want to think about providing gender neutral options, but not have the funding or the space to do that. They might want to continue working trans inclusively really explicitly because they have been for years, but they're worried about legal challenge and different organisations have different thresholds for that kind of risk, I suppose. And I think it's just placing a huge burden on organisations and providers to do something that is really, really actually, like, when you start thinking about it, feels quite unworkable. And that's not even mentioning the very, very real impacts and implications that we are seeing in terms of kind of self-exclusion, segregation in services, and the impact on people's well-being as well as a result of this ruling.
Great answer. Thank you.
How about you, following your presentation, kind of challenges and hopes, I guess?
I think the main challenge for me is it's a double-edged sword, because not only do I run a domestic abuse service for trans non-binary people, I'm actually from the trans non-binary community, so I live it. I think the best thing you can do is just be person-centered and try and keep safety in mind when you're dealing with people. You might not be able to provide the service that they are seeking due to policies, but what you should do, I think, morally, at least be aware of what services can support that individual that are out there, and signpost and do all you can to ensure that they have that experience where, it's not personal, but we can't support you. However, this organization can, and ensure that they're given that information, because like leaving a person with no alternative option and just dismissing is actually creates further harm for that individual, and they're more likely to engage in risk-taking behavior, as in going back to homes where they are being abused. And from looking at it through my intersectional lens in the service that I run. But yeah, I wish I had the answer, Alex, because I'd be in government or prime minister. But yeah, to me, I mean, I've got to be careful here, because I don't want to say anything too derogatory, but I think the Equality Act since 2010 has been there. It's been there for people to run services and to ensure that everyone has an equal right and access to services. That this whole people are safer if certain marginalized groups are excluded doesn't make sense, because if there had been an increase in violence against women and girls because of the Equality Act, I could understand it, but there hasn't been, and there isn't. And excluding trans people from single-sex spaces won't make women and girls safer. It'll just increase the likelihood of harm or risk to the trans community. But also, I have friends who are non-binary or assigned female at birth, or butch lesbians, who are now being accosted in single-sex spaces because they don't fit atypical presentations of gender. So like it's making society that was intolerant even more intolerable. So yeah, it's really sad. Like, just a person, I'm a training counselor. I'm about to qualify, and like one of the concepts of psychotherapy is like phenomenology. So a person knows himself better than anyone else, and you touched upon that in your own presentation, Alex. Like, the person knows who they are. Someone doesn't need to tell me who I am not. I know who I am. I didn't just choose this and wake up and say, do you know what, I'm going to be trans. I had so much privilege being a cis heterosexual male. I didn't just give this up because on a whim. And I wish people would see it with that kind of lens, but unfortunately, yeah, they don't. But if we can do anything in our own service offering to make those people be more comfortable and have a better journey, then that's the best we can hope for, isn't it? Someone's asked, are there any ways or resources available to help challenging services that are excluding trans people unnecessarily?
You may have some thoughts on this, Debbie, but I often signpost individuals and organisations to like resources like Transactional, who
I was just going to say that.
collate like a lot of they might have resources for challenging something in a more kind of advocacy or sense, like campaigning sense, like writing to your MP, but they also have, for example, information about what to do if someone is being denied gender affirming kind of care or like hormones from their GP practice. or whatever. So there are kind of really important kind of toolkits and information sheets on the transactional website.
Yeah, so transactional is a good one. Translucent is another one that's fantastic. And, you know, from a self-preservation point of view, believe it or not, I've not read the guidance, the EHRC's guidance for services. There are people out there who are legally trained. For example, Oscar Davies, the non-binary barrister, who I follow and get his legal interpretation of it. He's an expert by experience. They, you know, not only are they like a barrister, but they're also, you know, from the trans non-binary community. So I would much rather wait for them to read the guidance and then them to, you know, share what their view is and interpretation of it is. But you made an important emphasis as well, Alex, the kind of the onus is on the services, not the service user in all of this as well, which places the burden even like more so for organizations.
Right. One thing I'd really recommend reading actually is Gendered Intelligence statement on the EHRC code from when that kind of came out in draft form a couple of weeks ago. And something they say towards the end is, you know, keep living your life. And it really draws out, I think they kind of structure it in terms of good, bad, and ugly in terms of what's in the resource. So it's a really, really useful breakdown, but also it kind of comes from that kind of perspective of actually people's right to live their lives peacefully and safely. And I really valued in your presentation, Debbie, the way you kind of framed that it all around safety, but also harm reduction and person-centered support.
Yeah, I think it can be almost overwhelming for someone in a service if they're trying to navigate this and do the job that they do in an already pressurized environment with limited resources, and just kind of shy away or be reluctant to engage in this kind of support with these individuals who come from marginalized groups who have a lot of needs. But actually, if you adopt the same approach as you do with everyone else and just be led by the person, assess what they need, and then do your best to build a PHP around their needs, then, you know, we're not reinventing the wheel here. It's just giving you a different way of actually, hopefully it's emboldened people and they've got a bit more courage around having these conversations now. And if you're afraid, ask the trans person sitting in front of you, like, you know, ask them, you know, how they want to be referred to, what their pronouns are. And like you've already got their guard down, because most trans people won't even ask that. People just make assumptions based on appearance.
Yeah, it feels like such an important point to end on, around like listening, asking and listening and not making assumptions, as you said earlier. And when I deliver training, something we always say at Stonewall Housing is LGBTQ plus inclusion more broadly, trans inclusive practice as kind of part of that. It's just another kind of lens on person-centered, trauma-informed, psychologically informed working. And because it's about listening to people, paying attention to what they're saying they want or need or have experienced, or how they see their kind of support needs or preferences, building trust. Yeah, mindful that we're coming up to time.
I think we are. But thank you everyone for engaging with the chat and the you know, on one of the hottest days ever.
Absolutely.
I know it's quite a heavy subject, but we do appreciate you turning up and taking part and being active in the discussion. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone. Thanks for having us and me, and thank you, Debbie, as well.
Yeah, you're welcome, Alex. It's been a pleasure to meet you virtually. Thank you, St. Martin in the Fields, for organising and running this conference. It's been a pleasure speaking.
Stay cool, everyone. Take care.
Thanks.